So I would like to call upon the Prime Minister to start up this debate. Here.
All right, everyone hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I'll take a POI, preferably from CO, and POIs in the chat, please. Thank you. Given our team name, it brings me great displeasure to say this, but Joe Biden probably fucked up massively. It's going to be a lot better for Donald Trump to be in the interests of Ukraine. First thing I want to characterize here, what is in the interest of Ukraine? We're going to say something very simple at the top of framing. This debate is about the interests of the Ukrainian people. We are going to say that the interest of the Ukrainian people, first and foremost, is an end to the conflict, an end to the meat grinder, which kills hundreds of thousands of soldiers, an end to senseless brutality and bloodshed. Second piece of characterization, what is Trump likely to do? I think Trump is likely to do three things. First, he's likely not going to want to spend very much. He's very isolationist. He's very restraining when it comes to the fiscal expenditures of the United States, particularly on its foreign allies. He wants to be an American isolationist. He wants to break from the neoconservative policies which previously dominated Washington. Secondly, Trump wants to appear like a big, powerful strongman. He wants to appear as though he is a very good and skilled negotiator. That means he has a strong incentive to want to end the conflict as quickly as possible. Thirdly, he has previously promised that he is going to immediately make Ukrainian aid contingent on some sort of mediated ceasefire with Putin. That means the first thing he's probably going to do when he gets into office with Ukraine is attempt to mediate this ceasefire. Our argument then is going to be very simple. Trump is likely going to be successful at getting this ceasefire. Even if the ceasefire terms are not fantastic for Ukraine, they are preferable to the alternative, which is likely continuing conflict. Also, real quickly, the counterfactual is probably like Harris gets in office. That's probably worse, as we're going to explain, because Harris is basically going to continue a lot of the same policies as Joe Biden. Okay, then. Why is it going to be the case that Putin is likely going to be willing to acquiesce to Trump's request for peace? I think this is the first major burden. Firstly, Putin likes Trump on a personal level. Russia was heavily involved in financing the campaigns of the Republican Party for a reason. They likely wanted Trump to be into power because Putin likes Trump. He likes him as a person. They're both sort of buddy-buddy. They're both sort of authoritarians generally. I think that on a personal level, Putin is likely to be more willing to acquiesce to Trump. But secondly, Putin knows that Trump is somewhat erratic and fickle. He changes his mind all the fucking time. That means that Putin wants certainty on a deal as quickly as possible. He perceives that his position is likely to deteriorate in the long term if he does not take the first opportunity to mediate a ceasefire with the United States. Because critically, Putin has strong incentives to end the conflict too. He just wants to end it on slightly more favorable terms to Russia. This is both because Putin has strong internal incentives with, breakaway factions inside his own military that want to end the conflict, as well as the idea that he wants to turn his attention to other breakaway provinces like those in Russia's position in Georgia or Russia's position in Syria that he'd much rather be focusing on relative to Ukraine. The important thing here is, without Trump going to the negotiating table first, Putin would likely not be willing to go to the negotiating table because it makes him look weak perceptually on the international stage. It makes him look like he is going to surrender. That's why when Harris gets into power, she is also not likely going to go to the negotiating table because critically, the Democrats have positioned the fight for Ukraine as an existential threat to democracy itself, so they're unlikely to backtrack substantially on 4 years of Biden's policy. Trump represents a clean break with the previous administration, who is likely to come to Putin first, and Putin is likely to acquiesce and talk to these deals. But lastly, Trump is the only actor with the capacity to do this in the first place. Even if miraculously Harris won the presidency, the Republican Party still stood to dominate Congress. That means that Trump's agenda is the only one that can focus the Republican Party and the national American consciousness around a single unifying message that gets us to the point where we can talk about a ceasefire in the first place, reversing the previous years of policy. The characterization then is simple. The ceasefire deal is likely going to be accepted by Putin and is likely probably also going to be accepted by Ukraine because unfortunately Ukraine doesn't have much other choice in the matter. They realize that in accepting this ceasefire, this is likely their only option and likely the best deal that they are going to get. Why is this peace preferable to the alternative? But before that, I will actually take the POI.
I mean, I don't know about wanting Trump to come to the negotiating table. I think the real reason Putin wants him in office is because he will pull support to Ukraine, thus making Putin's job that much easier. That seems to me the principal reason.
The problem is that pulling that support to Ukraine is contingent on a ceasefire deal being struck. Like, Trump isn't just going to pull support for no reason. He wants to appear like a good negotiator to this. Like, Trump has not only explicitly said these things, but it would also just make no fucking sense for him to do this. And this is also, contingent on proving that the ceasefire deal doesn't work. I think I already explained why that is likely to be the case. The argument then then, is that Ukraine needs this deal now, and its position is significantly likely to deteriorate in the future. Why? Several structural reasons. Firstly, Ukraine's counteroffensive failed. They failed in Donetsk and Luhansk. They failed to make substantial grounds into Russian territory. They failed to capture any Russian territory in the long term. They were able to concede to bring them to the negotiating table absent some sort of intervention by the United States. The structural reasons for this are twofold. One, a lack of manpower. Ukraine physically doesn't have enough young people in its country anymore that it can keep feeding into the meat grinder. But secondly, it's just the lack of capacity to meaningfully threaten a nuclear armed state. Putin can always just threaten to push the big red button that says, fuck you, I'm ending the world, at any time where Ukraine stands to actually make any substantial progress into Russia. That means that Ukraine can never meaningfully go on the offensive, which means that its position is always going to get worse and worse. It is always going to deteriorate. The long-term interest of the Ukrainian people, therefore, is to end the conflict as quickly as possible. Importantly, Ukraine's ploy to stage offensive weapons under Biden has also failed categorically. Putin has retaliated with ICBMs into major Ukrainian cities, which also threaten their civilian populations, meaning the morale of the Ukrainian people is also likely to rapidly deteriorate as civilian centers in the West, which are previously protected from the front lines of the conflict, are rapidly becoming targets under military engagement. This means that Ukraine is running out of men, it's running out of weapons, it's running out of political will to keep the fight going. Zelensky is also getting increasingly unpopular as a result of this, which means he can't even propagandize effectively to his other European partners in an attempt to keep the conflict going. What that means then is if Ukraine doesn't get a ceasefire now, their position is substantially likely to deteriorate. They're going to get a much, much worse deal in the future. Trump is the only actor capable of bringing them a ceasefire now that is in the greatest interests of the Ukrainian people. Counterfactually, escalation gets far worse for a few reasons. Firstly, Harris would likely keep pushing for more advanced weapons, towing the Democrats' party line and supplying Ukraine with lethal militaries. This not only puts some marginal risk of Russia using the nuclear option, which is obviously the worst case scenario in Ukraine, so you have to go some percent probability that Ukraine just gets fucking obliterated off the map on their side of the house. But secondly, this just leads to a long, slow stalemate and death by attrition. Kamala would be unable to maintain support in the long term, which means they get no negotiating prospect on their side of the house. But let's give them the worst case scenario here. Peace talks fall through and Russia keeps attacking. I'd submit that Trump would still be better, because if he moderately reduces support, then Ukraine would just be forced to surrender anyways, which means even if the conflict comes to an end on less favorable terms, even if Ukraine gets bulldozed ultimately and is forced into an absolute defeat, I think that's actually still better for the Ukrainian people. They don't get fed into the meat grinder as much. It is a pointless war. They cannot keep fighting. It is impossible for them to stage a comeback. That much has been made abundantly clear. Trump is the only actor who can either bring a quick resolution to the conflict or make the slow death a little bit less painful, give them a little bit of palliative care at the end of their lifespan. Vote OG.
I would like to thank Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Leader of Opposition to start a case for opening opposition. Hear, hear.
Three, two. Okay, sorry. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, 3, 2, 1. I thought OO was a good place to be in this debate. And then PM explained why they think a weaker Ukraine is better for Ukraine. And they convinced me I was right. In this speech, I'm going to do first an explanation of why a stronger Ukraine is in Ukraine's interest. And then I'm going to explain why we empower Ukraine so much on our side. Firstly, and why is it in Ukraine's interest? First thing I want to establish here is why most of PM's explanations are off clash when they explain Putin wants an end to the war. Why do we think that a weaker Ukraine will mean Putin wants to proliferate the war? So they're right about the fact that there are other pressures. The problem is that the marginal cost of a few more months if Ukraine is on the cusp of surrendering, like they explained, because of shortages if they're not supplied by international military aid, is worth, those few more months are worth being able to reinvent the narrative on the war. The fact that Russians with VPNs can see that we're finally invading, the fact that we reinstate public trust is worth it in order to reclaim years of losses. Secondly, because he can undo manpower losses, like be able to reclaim prisoners that he got from Russian Ukrainian towns and use them as manpower. Thirdly, because he has resources from the rich region of Donetsk that he's able to extract, for example, oil shortages that he's getting currently for the Caucasus, whatever that area, or things that he can do if he conquers part part of Ukraine, which is why if he has an ability to succeed, while they are right that in case of likely failure, he doesn't want to, if he's likely to succeed, those few more months are worth it, which is why he will proliferate the war. Second thing I want to establish here, they say a stronger Ukraine won't get peace. But like, people don't like dying, especially when they were the ones invaded. They're not entrenched in some sort of incredibly strong national narrative of invasion. They're defending their homelands and their countries, and have many people they know died. They want the war to stop, which is why when they start posting stories about the fact that now that we got our country back, we want it to end, this means international pressure on Ukraine flips, and Kamala is willing to accept the deal. Otherwise, it seems like she's not answering the wishes of the Ukrainian people. So if Ukraine is powerful, the second it feels like it got back enough of its territory, Kamala will want to strike a deal back. That's it. Let's talk now about why Ukraine is much weaker in our side of the house. Several pieces of characterization that CG can contradict. First, they agree that Trump is an incredible isolationist in terms of the wish to divest from Ukraine. That is to say, the intense internal focus is motivated both by his wish to distinguish from neoconservatives, as OG say, by saying that he'll focus on the country itself, but secondly, because he wants to say that you care, that Trump cares about you, money to the American people, as opposed to elites that fund other allies. Second reason, he also has much less money to pay, even if he's more willing to invest in Ukraine, for the simple reason that his tariffs right now are going to cost the US a massive budgetary constraint. They have to trade off that. Third, he plans to subsidize Israel in its military campaign much more, which is likely to be more expensive since it's finding a stronger enemy in the form of Iran. That means he's going to have to pool a lot of the money he has left in military campaigns into Israel. Fourth, he's antagonized from NATO and EU allies because of the sense that after the Marshall Plan and support of EU allies, they're still paying under their NATO obligations, particularly states in East Europe that are protected by Russia, which is why he doesn't want to help the EU security goal of protection because he thinks the EU doesn't deserve it. Fifth, he's friendly with Putin and feels like Putin is less of a threat, and Putin's empowerment on the world stage is good for him because it means the ally he has chosen seems like the one that won the horse race, which is why he seems like a better business leader. But the second way in which I want to prove that Trump helps is not just the fact that he wants to divest from Ukraine, but that he actively supports Russia's campaigns and make it more possible of active aggression. First, we think that his current approach towards China means that China wants to grow much closer to Russia. Currently, China prefers maintaining relations with the West, as can be seen from the fact that they rejected technology agreements with Russia. For example, they're unwilling to give parts of the world's largest fleet to Russia battleships so that they can use in the Black Sea, and they're unwilling to give technology for all sorts of rockets and getting planes out of the sky technology. Oh my God. And Vladimira, you think I'm not ESL. Getting rockets out of the sky stuff, etc. And the reason for this is because the imports to the United States can't be met by Russia's low purchasing power. But if the United States imposes a 200% tariff, China might as well just appeal to a purchasing crowd in Russia that's also more likely to be willing to collaborate with them on lower regulation, which means China starts buying up Russian bonds, which allows Russia to drop interest rates on its bonds and appreciates the value of Russian bonds right now, drawing other investors. It means China, in order to get trade deals with Russia quickly, is more willing to give military capacities like battleships or even surveillance technology on the areas in which Russia's already conquered in Ukraine, which means that China is much more supportive of Russia and gives it much more of a lifeline that saves Putin from all the constraints that OG explains. So if you thought Putin wanted to end the war because of lack of manpower, the fact that China brokers more agreements with North Korea where he gets more soldiers right now resolves that tension and means he doesn't have to end the war sooner, flipping OG's mechanisms there. I want to weigh the impacts of this argument before I explain more why war becomes worse. First, notice that even if you don't know which side proves war better, Trump's wish to divest proves two things that are external to the metric of war in the round. First, he's much less likely to be willing to accept Ukrainian assaylees or pressure European allies to accept Ukrainian assaylees, which matters because millions of people that have no home, millions of Ukrainians, as OG paint this debate, need a home in the form of diplomatic assistance and humanitarian assistance. Less assaylees get in under Trump. Second, less humanitarian aid. Even if we lose some part of the territory, the fact that Kiev and Western Ukraine get more money to rebuild, more construction resources, more TV to see local radio news and hear their own media to not be scared of bombarding shells that destroy their towns, means that we get more reconstruction in the areas that aren't under the war through humanitarian efforts. Bottom half.
So a stronger Ukraine is only winning in the round if you can explain why that means they're going to win the war. Otherwise, you just prolong conflicts and lead to more.
But I explained explained why it's true, because Putin doesn't want to fight a stronger Ukraine, because he knows all the costs OG explained, and it's only worth it if he knows he's going to win, because then it's worth turning the war and the narrative around. Last thing I want to talk about. Even though I already proved that the war will be longer, why, even if the chance of war being longer on their side is marginally higher, why do we think that a deal that's bad for Ukraine matters a lot to the Ukrainian people? First, it means that a substantial amount of Ukrainian people that are currently living on the seam and on the battleground now live in Russian territories under a regime that doesn't credit them and puts them in jail for dissenting against Putin, under a regime that deprioritizes them economically and takes resources away to divert to Moscow oligarchs, as opposed to a democratic regime that has to cater to them. This means these people in the long term will be living under an administration that they are disgusted with and that doesn't appeal to them. In the long term, these deals are really bad for them. But secondly, the sense of national sovereignty might sound fluff, but it's really important. The entirety of the Ukrainian people are choosing to post and choosing to continue fighting because they don't want their country gone, even if it means a few more months. Opening opposition.
I would like to thank Leader of Opposition for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Deputy Prime Minister to continue with the case for opening government. Hear, hear.
Hello, can you hear and see me?
Yes to both.
Great. POS in the chat, please. Two very simple things in my speech. First, why Russia has independent to end the war, but that misundertaken our argument. It is not that they will end the war now, it is that the tipping point is likely to be a weaker Ukraine. Second is that even if the peace deal falls through, for example, like taking up their best case that this peace deal is likely to be really, really bad, why is ending a humanitarian crisis still the most important argument in this debate and most important impact that you should weigh above anything the opposition says? Firstly, let's talk about how we're able to end the war quicker by basically having Trump in power. Opposition says that because of the reasons that we've identified, that Russia has independent reasons to end the war, this means that a stronger Ukraine is actually going to make this better because it means that they're going to get better deal and Russia would end the war anyways. I think CG correctly points out that it requires them to prove why this war is winnable in the first place. I would posit that firstly, Will actually gave you a shit ton of reasons as to why this war is not winnable and that was not really engaged in, other than just counter asserting the fact that Russia might have reason to want to end a war. But second, this misses the nuance in Will's case because Russia has the incentive to end the war if Putin doesn't have to look like a moron that stepped into the negotiating table in the first place. Will uniquely mechanizes to you that Putin would not want to do that absent the understanding or absent the knowing that Trump is also willing to step on the table first, making that narrative significantly better. What happens on their side of the house is that a stronger Ukraine isn't going to lead Putin to step into the negotiating table, but probably radicalize and continue to prolong the conflict. We know this to be true because Waji made me debate around about, recently Ukraine launching an attack on Russia. They've clearly tried to push on even stronger front and potentially even counter-striking Russia. It obviously didn't work and Russia did not end the war because they were radicalized in the first place, because they perceived this to be an insult to their military, because they perceive that this is an act of moron if they actively lose the war now. We think that the reasons we gave you as to why they're likely to come to a peace, to a negotiating table is the separate reason from all of these things, is that they know that it's beneficial to end the war, and therefore if someone's willing to put up a negotiating deal, that they're able to benefit maybe a little bit more than they were, or get some more concessions than they were than they were able before, they're obviously willing to do this because there's cost to war. But obviously the calculus isn't just as simple as they would do this anyways, because the comparative on the opposition side is not only coming to the negotiating table, but probably prolonging that conflict in and of itself because of a stronger Ukraine, forcing them to look like morons. Putin is probably unwilling to do this. We think that Ukraine is likely not going to sue for peace absent Trump for the reasons that Will gave you, but two more. One, they're probably always going to perceive the West as backing them, therefore they're overwhelmingly likely to strike for things or promise things or put soldiers in places where they don't win a war, but they just do it anyways because they think that the West is always going to back them, when in reality, the West is suffering from two things. One, probably fickling support because there's no idea how America is going to supply these things continuously, and they haven't been doing that factually in the past. But two, that the EU is completely fucking drained as a result of the energy crisis, which means that they're no longer able to supply them with the same types of weapons or the same type of support that you were talking about. It's unclear how any of those things is going to continue to win the war. But two, Ukraine has strong nationalist narratives by their analysis, which means that they're forcing they're not forcing, but people are going and feeding themselves to the meat grinder, which means that it is unlikely in the past that they were winning the war, but people are just losing their lives overall. We think that the strong Ukraine does not succeed in bringing Putin to the negotiating table for the reasons that we said, which was never responded by LO. This is also because if Putin is entrenched in Ukraine, like they said, he will fight it out anyways. We think the best case in our side of the house, even though it's not ideal, is some level of concession, some level of Putin feeling like, at least I got something out of this, and so they're willing to end the war. The bottom line of my analysis is obviously the calculus a political leader is not going to be as simple as is this war going to cost me, or is this war not going to cost me? Obviously, the war is going to cost Ukraine as well as cost Russia. But Russia's calculus is this cost going to override the potential horrible international perception, but also just a fucking ego breaking idea that I made the concession. We changed that tipping point on our side when we forced Trump to come out and make that negotiating deal in the first place. But there's also greater certainty that that deal actually goes through as a result of Trump being relatively consistent with things that he said in the past. But secondarily, which was never responded to by opposition, which is Kamala does not have the House nor Congress. I have no idea what the fuck she was going to do anyways, whereas Trump has significantly greater power to at least put forward some type of plan that was going to be consistent, certain, and probably predictable by both Ukraine, Russia, as well as the rest of the Western countries. So obviously, even in capacity, Trump is better able to do that. Before I go on, I'll take a point from closing, if they have one. Opening?
If Kamala
Sorry, go.
If Kamala accepts, if Ukraine accepts, then Kamala will offer the deal because the Ukrainians want it. If Ukraine doesn't accept and doesn't want a deal to broker peace, then they won't accept it even if Trump is willing to broker it.
Yeah, but our analysis relies on two things that you ignore. The first is the perception from Putin, which is obviously different if Kamala was elected, whereas the perception of Trump is much more favorable and that Putin's much more willing to come to the table because they've done it in the past, back in 2016 to 2020. But secondly, and more importantly, we told you that logistically this is impossible because Kamala doesn't have the House and Congress and Trump has the House and Congress, so they're more likely to put a unilateral front. All of this analysis was just ignored. All of this spec was just ignored, which is really sad because, the one time we have spec. Okay, secondly then, let's talk about why even if the peace deal falls through and that look, there are concessions that are made, and that was the end of Amitai's speech, right? Which is sovereignty is so important and concession is really, really bad. For the reason that I explained, that if Russia finds a chance to not look like completely stupid people, but still able to end the war, is the reason why they probably wouldn't restart the war and make further concessions in the future, because it was probably really costly this time. They probably didn't want to lose it to look like morons, but if they were able to end the war, it's probably going to take them many years before they even consider starting a second one, which means the sovereignty that you talk about isn't going to be threatened again in any probable outcome. But secondly, we would weigh that ending the war is just so much more important. And I think Will already did this. Look, even if you have to make concession, and that's just really, really sad for people, sovereignty is not that important if your life is being taken away. I would say that being alive is the prerequisite to having anything like national glory of sovereignty, or even being able to feed yourself of all of these things, right? If you lose all of these things on their side of the house, which is true because you're feeding yourself, you're being conscripted, you're feeding yourself into a meat grinder of a war that you're never going to win, but just continuously prolong, it is probably not a good thing. We think that even if you have to make concession, we're willing to take the bullet here, and the concession is just, okay, at least it's quicker for us to rebuild our economy. It is quicker for these people to not die. It is easier to avoid a horrible humanitarian crisis to go even further. All those reasons, proud to propose.
I would like to thank Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Deputy Leader of Opposition to close up the top half. Here.
All right, give me a second. Okay. I assume you can see me and hear me, right?
Yep.
Perfect. I'm going to do three simple things in this speech. First, I'm going to explain why that deal will fall through, but absent of funding, the continuous war will be disastrous for Ukraine. Second, I'm going to explain why even if they do get the deal, on the current terms, it's the most horrible deal. Lastly, I'm going to explain why on the comparative, with funding being prolonged for a bit longer, Russia is likely to come into on the table and accept a far better deal. Few extraneous things. What if Kamala got elected? They can't just say, well, Trump has Congress and Senate and Kamala doesn't. We are obviously reimagining a very different result of the elections. If Kamala would have had enough of the popular support to be winning, then it's very plausible that she would also have at least backing of Congress and the Senate. Second, like the Kamala's perception with Putin, I don't think that's going to be the most relevant thing. The most relevant thing for Putin will be in terms of what the actual practical outcomes of the deal. I think that he's very much will be willing to come to the table, even if it's brokered by the US under Kamala, if it would be making much more practical sense. What happens if you lose the US funding? There's option one that I'm going to explain is far more likely, which is that Ukraine and Russia will continue trying to fight. That will likely result to really disastrous loss for Ukraine. Option two, less likely, but also really bad. Ukraine has to accept a terrible deal with Trump that would leave it in a terrible situation. The first thing then, why they're likely to not going to get the deal. This is the first assumption of OG that they are really banking their entire case on, but it's not true. The first thing that they would have to explain is that Zelensky would actually accept the deal. But the problem is, one, that there is already a big sunk cost, and it matters for his political future to be able to at least try to continue the war. But two, given that the losses would include so much really important parts of the territory, he's likely to be at least trying. More importantly, they need to be proving that Putin would accept the deal. But here's the problem. Trump will not continue to fund Ukraine, even if Putin would not accept the deal. The reasons are all the things that Amitai gave you, like the fact that Trump wants to be internally focusing on manufacturing or saving money for his tariffs, the fact that his Republican base and the Republicans in Congress don't care about Ukraine. Like, Republicans have been trying to block the funding for ages, and the fact that Trump wants to be focusing on Israel. So even if Russia doesn't accept the deal, Trump will withdraw the funding. And if that's true, if Putin knows that the funding is not going to continue, why the fuck would he now getting a deal when he can go and roll over in Ukraine that's not getting a funding anymore? So I think the more likely scenario is that the war is going to continue. That is absolutely terrible, because what would happen in that instance? Number one, Russia will be very likely to be able to roll over the currently expensive front line in Donetsk, being able to completely take loads of Ukrainian territory that is absolutely crucial for how the country's economy and where the people are currently living, being able to enter larger cities that Russia is currently encircling. The mobilization would obviously get far worse, because you can't even guarantee better arms, which you can with the extra funding that will be coming in. So you would not be able to put in more soldiers. Ukraine would not be able to receive more defensive weaponry. So you would have many, many more people dying. Russia will be able to roll over Ukraine immediately. That is the worst case scenario that is very, very likely to happen under opening government. They didn't explain why that deal would go through. It's far more likely that this will be just the worst case scenario where not only people are dying, but also, and the war wouldn't end, but also be far worse for Ukraine. Why then, even if the deal would come through, it would be absolutely terrible for Ukraine? Number one, it would mean that you will be losing huge amounts of territory that is incredibly important for Ukrainian survival towards the future. Currently, Russia holds 20% of Ukrainian territory. The deal would probably include even more if they are correct that Trump would just want to be, appeasing Putin. They would include incredibly important economic territory. For example, like Pokrovsk, where you have steel center that Russia would be able to grab and reduce Ukrainian economic ability in the future. The fact that many people who are living in those areas, as Amitai described, the things that you have access to Black Sea, for example, that is really important for Ukrainian shipping, agricultural areas. All of that means that Ukraine will be ended with a really terrible deal, when you will be losing both people, territory, and the economic availability of the country. Secondly, the deal would prevent Ukraine from being able to join NATO. That is something that Trump would not be requiring, because he himself is not massively in favor of NATO, which means that even if they would get the deal now, Ukraine would never have a guarantee that there's not going to be another attack in the future. So both of these scenarios are disastrous. War coming longer, more likely, is terrible. The deal will be terrible. If we are able to prove that there is a decent chance of things getting better with extra funding, we have to be winning this top half. why keeping the war going on for longer, or at least having a promise of funding, which would likely happen under Kamala, as they are conceding. There's a precedent of it happening under Biden administration. There were campaign promises under Kamala. It is far more within the philosophy of the Democratic Party. Obviously, the war will not end by any side decisively winning. We don't have to prove Ukraine is going to win. This is ludicrous. We need to explain that it's going to be going for long enough, or there's going to be a calculation of Russia that it could be going for long enough, that Russia will be forced to accepting a deal that is far better for Ukraine. If the funding is likely to continue, then the Russian calculus would be to accept a better deal. I want to explain the reasons why. What are the opening government's reasons why it would get worse for Ukraine? First, they say nuclear option. Come on, if Russia tried to nuke Ukraine, US has stationed nukes in Turkey. Obviously, that's never going to happen. The second reason, the only other reason, is manpower. The problem is, sure, Ukraine has conscription problems, but it's far more outweighed by the long-term or even like short-term manpower problems with Russia. Russian men are dying on a far higher rate than Ukrainian manpower. This is factually true, and we know it because Russia is doing ridiculous things like borrowing troops from North Korea to be able to compensate for their lack of conscription. If Ukraine loses its funding, Russia can just roll over them. But if Russia is willing to come to the table, his manpower, he would know that his manpower will also going to deplete. CG?
Yeah, so your analysis is that Ukraine becomes weaker after Trump gets elected, which suggests that Ukraine is pretty strong now, yet Ukraine is still getting its ass kicked by Russia. So what is the margin of your argument on OO?
No, I don't think that Ukraine, first of all, I don't think that Ukraine is getting its ass kicked to Russia. I think if the situation stayed roughly the same, it would be fine. But I'm also explaining quite likely to turn towards at least the change of calculation in favor of Ukraine, not to win the war, but prolong it for long enough that it's not war for Russia. The first reason was the manpower. I want to give more reasons. Second reason, Russia is expected to have a massive inflation. They're currently spending 33% of their budget on the military. The population is opposing the war because of the inflation that is actually harming them. This changed now because currently it is when Russia is starting to finally feel the economic impact of it. This is likely to push Putin towards ending. Thirdly, Russia is running out of military equipment. They are depending on refurbishing their old Soviet-era stock. They are running out of it. If it goes for a bit longer, if Putin expects it to go a bit longer, they will likely to come to a far better deal than continuing the war and killing people or getting a disastrous deal now. I'm very, very proud of those.
I would like to thank Deputy Leader of Op for that fine speech and for what was a great top half thus far. And I would like to call upon Member of Government to start a case for closing government. Here. To call upon Member of Opposition to start the case for CO. Here.
All right, I'll take a POI from opening at some point. The metric of this debate cannot be whoever ends the war faster. The metric of this debate has to be whoever ends the war in much more favorable terms for Ukraine itself, who guarantees the most benefits to their people, who guarantees the most safety to their economy in the future, who guarantees the most happiness and prosperity for the people of Ukraine that exist in the future. I want to note, I think that OG's assertion that it's just about the people of Ukraine seems a little implausible because the motion itself tells me it's in the interest of Ukraine itself. So it's not just every single person in Ukraine. It is the actual state, it is the actual national identity, it is the actual ability of this country to recover over time, to have their own sovereignty, to have their own policy. Obviously, that's what the motion asks us to consider in the first place. So yes, maybe CG's contributions as to why you're likely to get good policies, you're likely to get good trade deals, or good peace deals is actually standing in this round. But I think OG's concessions damn their case, because even in their best case, you absolutely screw over the people of Ukraine structurally. The extension from CO then is going to be really simple. We are going to guarantee better impacts for Ukraine by explaining first why there are mounting pressures on Russia, regardless of strength or all these vague terms thrown around. That means that Putin, as time goes goes on, is more and more likely to concede more and more things to achieve this equality. And secondly, why the presidency of Trump, or the non-existence of it, is the tipping point to ensuring that we can prolong and hold Ukraine on until such a time comes. Which means the more our case affects, the better kinds of benefits we gain for these people in the long term. That's how we'll win from CO. So 4 things I want to talk about in terms of why we guarantee better outcomes. The first one is that Putin's positioning is weakening uniquely, and there's a huge amount of pressure being placed upon him. I think this is pretty clear. Tons of people, even by concession of OG and CG in Russia, are still dying by a huge amount. These are fathers, brothers, sons, people who are integral to Russia's economy, but also really important to people who are already within Russia. So obviously, there's huge popular anger rising because the sentiment on the ground in Russia is Putin sends our sons and brothers and husbands away to war and they die for his random whim. And obviously, the people of Russia aren't super happy about this, and there's rising political pressure and anger among the politicians, like people of Russia themselves. And even if Russia isn't strictly democratic, obviously, this pressure still means something. It still means there are more riots in the streets. It still means there's more popular anger. It still means less people willing to enlist or support the war effort to begin with in ways that are costs that are hard for Putin to bear. But secondly, elites themselves obviously oppose the war as well, because they primarily bear the cost of this war in the first place, that they are the ones paying taxes to the Russian government, that they are the ones who are oftentimes bearing the cost of having to reconciliate people for these things, that they are the ones who are watching Russia standing on the international stage lower, watching their companies get less and less profits, watching their ability to influence the international economy and make their money fall more and more and more. So obviously, they themselves also intrinsically oppose Putin to a higher and higher extent at the point at which these costs rise. But also, there is pervasive incentives for these elites who are in positions of power within Russia to seize power for themselves or otherwise gain more power comparatively. So over time, the dangers to Putin of people within his own constituency or his own party turning against him because it's now politically favorable to do so are increasingly high, which means that regardless of what the actual terms are on the ground, the longer this carries on, the much more pressure is placed on Putin to actually capitulate and squeeze, even if they're quite bad. So the downline of this argument is that there is a clock that Putin is on and pressure is rising. So every bit of prolonging we can do is incentively a good thing. 3 additional mechanisms as to why we gain so much more support for Ukraine on our side and why that's the tipping point to allowing this prolonging. First, signaling effect. I think the US contributing to probably continuing to pour in resources is hugely important in terms of the signaling effect it does for both the Russian people, the Ukrainian people, and the international economy. In terms of Ukraine, I think it raises huge amounts of morale within Ukraine at the point at which you believe there's still huge amounts of funding coming in, huge amounts of weapons that you have that you're able to use in the first place. That one of these strongest democracies in the world is still supporting you, which means that this is the tipping point to Ukraine being able to hold out for much longer, for still being able to fight the war in the first place and prolong. But secondly, this motivates and creates pressures for other countries to also donate as well. First, because the US can negotiate and set up more aid as they empirically do by fast-tracking these things to Ukraine in the first place. But secondly, because now there exists a perception that Ukraine can win when the US is already pouring in money, which solves the collective action problem, wherein countries are worried of sending their resources when they don't think there will be returns for it. At the point at which the US is already pouring in a huge amount of capital to supplement these things, that's when other countries are also willing to do so as well. But the third thing I want to talk about is the volatility of aid that exists. Because even if it's the case that on either side, there's some support going to Ukraine, whether it be funding or weapons or whatever it is the case, we think that the Trump administration is extremely capricious and unpredictable. And this is something that uniquely hurts the war effort in Ukraine. Why? 3 reasons. First, because he hires terrible foreign policy advisors as a consequence of the campaign that he ran and the kinds of populist people that he put into office who he promised positions in the first place, which means the kinds of advising he does and the kinds of views these people hold are often quite bad. But secondly, Trump controls Congress and the House, and OG seems to think this is a good thing, but it's only a good thing in terms of the policies he passes actually being good themselves. So at the point at which Trump is extremely capricious, oftentimes yields to narratives or yields to his own whims to say things in public or contribute to things, at the point at which he thinks that, oh, the economy is slackening and the way I can win back some amount of popular support is by pulling support from Ukraine in certain instances. That's the point at which he's much more able to do these things on a whim much more quickly, which means it's harder for the international board and also for Ukraine itself to actually count on US aid coming in as a steady thing in the first place. Why does that matter? First of all, because when these things are really unpredictable, that's the point at which it becomes really, really much harder to actually plan the war effort in the first place. It becomes really, really difficult to count on the US weapons coming in or count on these things to begin with, which makes it really, really hard for this war effort to succeed. I'll take OG.
Every day the war goes on, thousands of Ukrainians die. This is a much more certain impact than any speculative impact on future geopolitical outcomes.
This is true.
How many more bodies is worth one?
Yeah, I got it. It's not speculative. It's scalar. At the point at which I can prove to you that there's pressures for Putin that are rising and we prolong the war for a month more, that means Putin is willing to concede to more things. What you can sign people to is constant lifetimes of suffering with the worst kinds of most abusive deals that Russia says. That's your own concession. I just don't think that's the debate. I don't think that's in the interest of the people. If the panel thinks otherwise, they can vote for you, I guess. Finally, on NATO and on NATO weakening and pulling away, and why this is hugely problematic for checking Russia's advances. I think the advent of Trump harshly erodes trust and commitment to NATO generally in a few ways that matter. First of all, because a lot of countries have perceptions of Trump as being rogue or untrustworthy, and therefore don't want to actually interact with him in terms of foreign policy much more cleanly. But secondly, because there's lower domestic support in these other countries to commit to NATO, at the point at which Trump oftentimes is really vocal in saying that NATO fails its obligation, or the countries of NATO are freeloading, which means that in other countries that are NATO adjacent, the people within those countries oftentimes argue to decrease funding to NATO or decrease enrollment in NATO as well. But thirdly, that countries have to reconsolidate their own resources to compensate for weaker NATO existing in the first place, which obviously means less military resources that can be dedicated to Ukraine in the beginning, because they have to first watch their own borders and cover for the lack of NATO existing or the lack of NATO's strength. What does this mean? This empowers and revitalizes Putin and Russia to a really strong extent, and allows way more extreme aggression from Russia because they don't fear retaliation from NATO, or don't have to worry about NATO being active in the area as a whole. Generally, the downline of this case is quite simple. We get better terms for peace because we explain why Russia's on a clock, and then we explain why the things that Trump does uniquely affects not only the US aid, but also aid from other countries as well, the backbone of Ukraine's resistance. And we explain to you why it is that when Trump gains the presidency, the backbone and ability for the resistance falls dramatically. The Gov comparative is one that is necessarily negative. They needed to prove we get something worse. If we prove to you that we get even slightly better deals, I think we get far better than that, we win this debate. Proud to win from CO.
I would like to thank member of opposition for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon government whip to close up the Gov bench instead of this debate. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. For POIs, just put them in the chat. I will take opening opposition. There are two observations I want to make about closing opposition. The first is, if you buy the first part of the closing opposition extension, it is a knife to opening opposition, and therefore you cannot credit it. And the reason behind this is because O gives a variety of different reasons as to why Russia is likely going to be super gung-ho and be super aggressive in the conflict in the first place. So closing opposition cannot say, well, even though that's true, actually, you know, Putin and the oligarchs and all of these individuals are likely going to pull out. But the point we make very clearly is, if that is the case, that is a good reason as to why Trump getting elected is good, because it means you just get the negotiation in the first instance, which means not only by your own metric of favorable deals do we get ahead, but second of all, it's also a far more expedited one, and therefore we win on that metric. The second observation I want to make about closing opposition is, it doesn't really matter what Trump is likely going to do in the future, because what we've established very clearly is two things that go unresponded to. The first thing we've established is, regardless, the problem is that Russia is likely going to get stronger over time, which means even if they can explain that commitments to NATO and other types of things also get stronger, that just proportionally explains far better than opening government why the escalation of conflict and why the amount of people dying increases, which explains a stronger incentive as to why there's pressure placed on these particular cases. So that is a far better explanation. But second and more importantly, it is also to say Trump has made it very explicit that it is one of his most important mandates to deal with what is happening in Ukraine right now. He literally said he's going to resolve it in 24 hours, but also structurally speaking, it is a huge political victory. So there's likely structural incentives for him to deal with it first. And as a result of that, even if Trump changes his mind later down the line, our argument is non-contingent on a continued engagement. It is just that Trump is going to start doing that negotiation, and that is going to be good. So that explains why closing opposition is out of this debate. Here then is the problem with op bench. The problem with op bench in this debate is they do not actually ever explain why a stronger Ukraine or a stronger anti-Russian force is a sufficient condition for victory in the round. And the reason why this matters is because even if it is the case that they prove their particular arguments, if they do not prove why it leads to victory necessarily, then all of the harms that we talk about in Matt's speech materialize, which is over time, Russia gets stronger. So you just get far more bloody conflicts and far more individuals that are likely going to die. So the first thing I want to do is respond to opening opposition. The first thing opening opposition says is, well, the issue now is that Russia becomes significantly, like whatever, but Ukraine becomes a lot weaker when Trump gets elected. And that presumably is a harm because when you have a stronger Ukraine, that disincentivizes Putin from engaging. I just want to fact check this argument. Because is this really true? Because think about the logic opening opposition uses in this debate. Opening opposition says once Trump gets elected and is in power, which will happen in the future because he hasn't been inaugurated yet, there will be a deficit in the amount of funding that Russia gets. And when that Ukraine gets, and when that happens, for some reason, that creates massive amounts of changes. But the issue is that presupposes that, Ukraine is not as strong as it was on the opposition, which is not true, because surely all of the opposition policies that opening opposition wants to do are things that Ukraine in the status quo has, But even despite this, Russia is still super aggressive in those particular regions, compounded by the fact of what Matt says, which is Russia is likely going to continually become stronger, which means you likely get more conflicts on their side. So if their metric is on, you need to push back against Russian forces in order to get some degree of appeasement and some degree of negotiation. It is far harder for you to get that on their side of the house. Then they say, well, no. But the benefit actually is, well, now Ukraine becomes substantially, stronger, and the alternative on our side is it becomes weaker. But importantly, we explain from closing government why Ukraine becoming weaker isn't necessarily a bad thing. I want to weigh this up against what Off-Bench says, because the Off-Bench claim in this debate is once Ukraine becomes really, really weak, Putin has an incentive to steamroll over Ukraine and invade because they have opportunistic abilities to do so. I want to first point out what Matt explains a member of government to no response from closing opposition, which is there are a series of reasons as to why there's no incentive for Putin to do so. Things, for example, like the fact that he wants to make some degree of concessions in the quid pro quo with Trump. So things, for example, like ensuring limited amount of involvement in NATO, limiting or ensuring a sphere of influence that Russia has in these particular regions. The issue and the reason why you never get to these points on opposition side is because of the nature of Kamala and Biden and the fact that they're super gung-ho and pro-NATO. This is why you only get that on our side, and that is why negotiation is far more likely on our side of the house. But the second thing I want to point out here, which is important, is the game theoretic incentive that exists for Putin, which is, even if it is the case, for example, that there's a perception that maybe Ukraine might get weaker over time. The problem is once Trump is out of office, for example, maybe whatever next party comes in might strong arm Ukraine as well, which means Putin obviously has strategic incentives to get the best deal possible at this particular instance. And that way there's an incentive to come towards that negotiating table. Why then is this particularly important in this debate? The reason why this is particularly important in this debate is because it better mechanizes opening governments than they do by, first of all, explaining the incentive of these particular leaders and how they likely interact with this deal. But second of all, explaining specifically why Russia gets stronger over time, which is an important piece of analysis to explain why the pressure opening government relies on is actually as salient as they claim. Because absent this analysis, opening opposition is probably right. There are a lot of other competing incentives that these policymakers have. So this particular analysis on vertical extension explains why it is likely the case that negotiations can happen and why that is therefore a good thing. Before I explain and impact this and weigh this further, opening up.
Even if you prove Russia grew stronger compared to Ukraine, you don't prove it's stronger than Ukraine in US weaponry. Putin will not accept the deal because he can make sure Ukraine won't join NATO by making sure there's no Ukraine left if he rolls over it.
No, but the point is, because Trump doesn't care that much about NATO, Putin has more incentive to just be like, okay, let's make a negotiation. There's far more risk on your side, A, because there's going to be a stalemate. But second of all, the analysis we explained, which is because Kamala and Biden are really pro-NATO, and therefore that creates a degree of involvement that leads to escalation. That is why more individuals therefore die on your side, and that's why you do not ever get negotiation, let alone the type of impacts that you want to get on your side of the house. The final thing that I want to respond to is the opening opposition argument on aid. I think there are a couple of things to point out here. The first is, our argument is logically prior, because if we can explain that negotiation is far more likely going to happen in the first instance, it thereby explains why less individuals are likely going to be displaced, why more territorial arrangements are unlikely going to happen, etc., which means less individuals necessarily are harmed. But second and more importantly, I don't actually think opening opposition explains how aid provision works, for the very simple reason that I presume on their side of the house, there's actually less incentive for aid to go there, because the only reason why individuals are able to give aid in the first instance is when there is some degree of stability and some semblance of negotiation happening. The comparative on their side, if you do have escalation, is it is far harder for aid workers to go in because there's massive uncertainty about what is going to happen. It is harder for aid workers to provide benefits to individuals on the ground, whereas on our side, it is far easier to couple that as a package for negotiation, and therefore you're far more likely going to get peace. At the end of this debate, the way you weigh this debate is very simple. We explain from closing government two things. First of all, why Russia is likely going to get stronger over time, which explains why you cannot just wait it out, and why even if there is a stronger Ukraine as opening opposition claims, you just get escalation and stalemate. But second and more importantly, we explain more proximate incentives for why Putin and Trump are likely going to come to the negotiation table, which mechanizes opening government and explains why peace is far more likely in those regions. That is why we win this debate.
I would like to thank Government Whip for that fine speech, and I would like to call upon Opposition Whip to deliver the last speech of this competition. Hear, hear.
I think at this point in the debate, we've been going back and forth about the strength of different countries. And while it may be true that a lot of this is debatable and we can counter assert as much as we want, one thing is clear, and that is the way that actually analyze this debate is by presuming that if Trump is to get rid of this war in 24 hours, which deal is likely to be, or who is likely to benefit from this deal, and which country is going to get fucked. I think in this case, the answer from CO has been very, very clear, which is that Ukraine is going to get a massively unnegotiable deal, which they are not going to be content with, and that in forth is going to lead to a lot more conflict, a lot more disability, and that means that all of the benefits coming from OG about removing the meat grinder is still going to exist, so long as different sides of the conflict are still very, very pissed off and still very discontent. How am I going to structure this speech? First, I'm just going to go through CG and point out the flaws of their case and why exactly the attacks have not worked. Secondly, go to OG, and lastly, prove why exactly on our case we provide a unique benefit apart from OO and why we can win this debate. So firstly, dealing with CG's claims, I think the first thing to note at the top of this is just a clarification, which is that this contradictory thing that Rahul provided about Putin is just not true, because I think most of what he was saying was that if Ukraine continues to get support, that is when the slackening activates. So Putin is going to show cracks in its exterior so long as Ukraine continues to mobilize and continues to stay strong, for the reason that he gave you about why there's so many different reasons as to why Putin is backing down and why Russia is slowly deteriorating and wearing away. But secondly, Putin can be gung-ho all he wants, but also secretly want out of the war. Just like on how your side, Ukraine is very much weakening, but it's also very determined to not negotiate and thus needs Trump, given your own characterization. But secondly, we think that even if we choose Putin being tenacious and strict right now, and we understand and accept this characterization, if Trump does solve the war in 24 hours, who is this likely to benefit? I think it's very, very simple. Trump will probably push aside Ukrainian interests to appease Putin and get this issue off his plate, because all the characterization about how Trump and Putin are chums and they're buddies probably also falls on their side as well, which is Trump is much more likely to appease Putin and roll over to him at the expense of Ukrainian interests, because he wants to appease Putin and has a lot of other interests that he wants to advance with him. So things like trade connections, things like deals and elections and things like that, Trump was probably going to pander towards Putin's own ideologies in order to get the conflict off of his plate and deal with other things domestically. That is exactly why we think that when we are very, very on our side of the house, even if we are prolonging the war, and even if we do have so much more power tensions, even if we do uplift Ukraine for an indefinite amount of time, this is how you get better concessions. We are willing to aim high during the negotiation table with Kamala, because we are able to pick and choose what to win on. We think Harris probably realizes that being gung-ho isn't sustainable. She does not want to make the same mistakes Biden did while in office. This means that when she is overall very strict when coming to the negotiation table, she can make concessions and make Russia feel like they are gaining something, when in actuality, she's just picking and choosing different things that she was willing to concede on to begin with. So we think that there are a lot of ways to get better deals in the long run that isn't as black and white as CG wants to claim. But secondly, I want to prove why, even if there are reasons why Ukraine and Russia will exacerbate, they should still continue to fight. One, I think Russia can foresee the fact that Ukraine is going to weaken, which means that deals placed under Trump are going to be poor. So think about economic independence. Russia is simultaneously also getting weaker. We do not think all the mechanisms coming from CG suddenly prove that they are very high and mighty. Obviously, a lot of other mechanization that we gave to you and O gave to you prove that Russia is as well getting weaker, because they are deteriorating. It's taking a lot of time for them to continue war effort, and internal domestic happiness is not at an all-time high as well. But thirdly, we also think that Trump is going to weaken Ukraine even more. So comparatively, even if Ukraine is weak right now, the absence of America and Trump's presence is going to weaken Ukraine even more and lead to worse deals in three ways. Firstly, they're going to reduce international support. Like Rahul told you, there's less mobilization on the international field, where previously the US would have done so to a much higher extent. They're going to mobilize, they're going to shepherd them, get a lot more aid and militarization into that region that can help Ukraine sustain their war efforts and not get just completely bulldozed by Russia. But secondly, they lack trade and aid that the U.S. would have otherwise given Ukraine. So things that don't even relate to the war effort explicitly, but things getting food and water and hot shelter and clothes, things that all of these things can actually sustain Ukrainian people are going to be taken away the moment that Trump does step back and away from Ukraine as well. But thirdly, we also think that this places a burden on the United Kingdom because of international instability. So even if there is an absence of Trump, that's not just an absence of the U.S. That's an absence absence of a lot of other big actors that Ukraine would have otherwise relied on for geopolitical support, like the UK, like France, because they're busy cleaning up the US's mess and absence in international spheres like the WHO and like the UN in and of itself. But lastly, I just want to prove and reiterate why Trump will roll over for Putin and why that means that the deals that are going to be reached are just so much worse overall for Ukraine, and you do not get a deal that is positive. You get a deal that is likely to be rolled over and that is going to be protested by Ukraine in the long run. Okay, dealing with OG now. I think a lot of the responses are likely the same, which is that the Trump will not negotiate quickly or well. And I just want to point to you that their largest thing that they say is like, oh, their best case is that there's so much unnecessary war gone. You get negotiations done very quickly and you avoid the meat grinder. But I'd like to contest this by just saying that I think the meat grinder is worth it for a lot of Ukrainian people. The fact that they're fighting for independence, fighting for territory, fighting for their own legitimacy are things that they're willing to die for in the long run. So I think that the reason why the US isn't just bankrolling them is because there is a legitimate interest by Zelensky and by the Ukrainian populace to actually back the war in and of itself. That is exactly why if you get bad negotiations, which they concede to, it's like a very it's like a very possible thing on their side house. You prolong war and conflict, and it's much more likely to be in resurgence. So when we prove to you why we get better deals, this means that we actually stop the meat grinder and have higher chances of just reducing conflict to reestablish itself in the long run. And how exactly do we take this case, and what are the unique impacts that we give to you from CO? Firstly, I think we lay the fundamentals of the case that opposition relies on, which is that Putin is weak and that this is a tipping point of the best case scenario. We give you the reasons why Putin is likely to acquiesce if the conflict continues and if Kamala or someone who isn't Trump is in office, because we think that Putin can step forward right now to avoid looking like an even bigger moron in the future. So there are existing incentives for him to come to the negotiation table. He's never going to do that on their side when he understands that Ukraine is continuously weakening and doesn't have the power of the US or the UK behind him. But secondly, we provide even more margins than OO about drawing the bigger gap between Putin empowerment and Ukraine weakening, which is to say that we give to you a lot more mechanisms on a far wider scale about why, if there is Trump in office, Ukraine will be weaker to a whole larger extent in of itself. We draw a lot bigger margins than just unclear, blurry lines. For all these reasons, oppose.
I would like to thank Opposition Whip for that fine speech and all four teams for an amazing debate. The